Paris, August 31st, 1997, just after midnight. The city was not asleep, but it was quieter than usual, as if something in the air had shifted. Streetlights reflected softly on damp pavement, and traffic signals continued to change colors for roads that had begun to empty. Paris has a way of slowing time at night, especially in the early hours when movement feels deliberate and every sound carries further than it should. Inside the Ritz Hotel, Princess Diana was waiting, not hiding, waiting. Waiting for the moment when leaving would not turn into spectacle, waiting for the noise to thin out, for the cameras to drift elsewhere, for the sense of being watched to loosen its grip even briefly. She had spent years learning how to move under observation, but that night the exhaustion ran deeper. This was not physical tiredness. It was a fatigue of constant awareness, of never being unrecorded. The evening had been tense in small, accumulating ways. Decisions were discussed quietly, then revisited. Routes were considered and dismissed. Timing mattered more than speed. The goal was not escape, but invisibility. To leave without creating another image that would later be dissected and explained. Shortly after 12:20 a.m., the plan changed. It was not sudden or dramatic. It was practical. A different exit, a different car, a belief that a quieter route would mean fewer eyes. The kind of decision made countless times before, without consequence. At the rear entrance of the hotel, a black Mercedes S280 waited with its engine idling low and steady. The street behind the Ritz looked ordinary, almost forgettable. No crowd, no flashes, no sense that history was about to compress itself into minutes. Inside the car were four people: Princess Diana, Dodi Fayed, Henri Paul, the driver, Trevor Reese Jones, the bodyguard. The doors closed, the vehicle pulled away, and Paris absorbed them almost immediately, as it always does. The car moved through the city with purpose. Streets passed in smooth succession. The sense of pressure began to ease. For a moment, it seemed as though the plan might work, that the night would end quietly, without consequence, without another headline waiting to be written. At approximately 12:23 a.m., the Mercedes approached the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. Tunnels change perception. Sound becomes sharper. Distance collapses. Light flickers unevenly across concrete walls, and speed feels amplified even when it is not. Inside the tunnel, the city narrows. There are fewer exits, fewer options, fewer ways for things to unfold gradually. The car entered the tunnel. What followed would later be reduced to seconds, diagrams, and official summaries. But in the moment, it unfolded as confusion. A sudden loss of control, a violent impact, metal meeting concrete with a force that echoed through the enclosed space. Glass shattered, the sound carried, then vanished. And then there was a pause, not silence in the sense of emptiness, but the stunned quiet that follows something irreversible. Dust hung in the air. Engines cooled. A few vehicles slowed, unsure whether to stop or continue. People hesitated before approaching, uncertain what they were about to see. Inside the wreckage, life had not yet disappeared. Witnesses would later describe movement, breathing. A woman who appeared conscious but disoriented, reacting to voices, not fully aware of what had happened. These moments were brief and chaotic, but they mattered because they meant the story was not yet finished. The outcome was not yet fixed. Someone called for help. Someone shouted. Someone reached for a phone. In Paris, emergencies do not remain isolated for long. The city is wired to respond, to classify, to react. Signals move quickly through systems designed to remove uncertainty from moments like this. And as the first minutes passed inside the tunnel, Before sirens and flashing lights filled the space, the night crossed an invisible threshold. A private attempt at disappearance became a public event. A quiet exit turned into a moment the world would revisit for decades. Above ground, Paris continued to breathe. Cafes closed, streets emptied. Somewhere nearby, the Seine moved without interruption. The city did not yet know what had happened beneath it, but something had already changed. The night was no longer ordinary, it was waiting to be remembered. The Pont de l'Alma tunnel didn't feel like a place where tragedy belonged. It was ordinary infrastructure, concrete, lane markings, a steady curve, the kind of space people pass through without thinking. But once the crash happened, the tunnel changed instantly. Sound behaved differently. Light behaved differently. Even time seemed to break into uneven pieces. For a few seconds after impact, there was no clear order to what people heard or saw. Some drivers slowed without understanding why, instinctively pressing brakes as dust and debris drifted into the roadway. A horn sounded once, then stopped, and someone shouted something that echoed and returned distorted, as if the tunnel itself couldn't decide what language it had heard. The Mercedes was not simply damaged, it looked folded. The front end had collapsed inward with a force that didn't suggest accident, so much as sudden, brutal geometry. Metal compressed into angles that made doors harder to find and windows meaningless. The air held a sharp smell, fuel, hot rubber, and the faint bite of smoke that didn't become a fire but still warned that it could. People approached in steps. Not everyone runs toward wreckage. Some freeze, some stare, some move closer as if pulled by responsibility they didn't ask for. Others keep driving because a brain insists it must be safer to keep moving. Inside the tunnel that night, you could feel those different instincts collide. A few witnesses would later describe seeing a flash. Others would say they didn't. Some would claim there was another car. Others would deny it. These contradictions started immediately, before anyone had time to shape a story. In moments like this, memory begins recording at different speeds for different people, and the first version of events is rarely consistent. What mattered most in those first minutes was simpler than theory. There were people inside the wreckage, and at least one of them was alive. Several witnesses described movement, subtle, human movement that didn't belong to something already finished. Breathing, a shift of the head, a sound that could have been pain or confusion. One person later said the woman in the back seemed awake, reacting when spoken to, her eyes open but unfocused, as if she was trying to understand why the world had suddenly become loud and heavy. Those details are important because they are time-sensitive. They exist only in the window before the body decides it cannot compensate anymore, before shock rewrites what a person can do, before medical reality becomes unavoidable. In that brief window, the situation is an emergency, not a conclusion. Someone tried to open a door. It didn't move. Someone else reached through broken glass and pulled back, startled by the sharp edges. A man shouted for an ambulance, and the word ambulance echoed through the tunnel like a command that didn't know who it was speaking to. In a city like Paris, emergencies don't stay private. They move quickly into systems. The first response is rarely heroic, it's procedural. A witness calls, a patrol unit reports, a monitoring point notices something wrong. The system begins to classify the event before the public even understands what it is. Down in the tunnel, that shift began in fragments. A phone held up to a face, a hurried description. There's been a crash. It's bad. People are trapped. The voice on the other end asking questions a witness can barely answer. Where are you? Which direction? How many vehicles? Is anyone conscious? Is anyone bleeding? That last question, conscious, matters more than it seems. It is a word that shapes speed. If a passenger is conscious, the situation can be framed as severe but survivable. If a passenger is unconscious, urgency spikes instantly. Conscious creates a dangerous kind of optimism, the sense that time exists, that there is room to stabilize, that the worst hasn't happened yet. A few vehicles stopped at a distance, hazard lights blinking like a nervous heartbeat. Some people held their hands over their mouths. Others spoke too loudly, as if volume could make the scene obey them. There is a strange social instinct in disasters. People look around for authority. They search for uniforms, for someone who knows what to do, for someone who can turn chaos into a list of steps. But inside the tunnel, authority arrives slowly because a tunnel itself interrupts a natural flow of the city. It's a corridor. It funnels sound and traffic and attention. It holds the scene in place until help arrives. And in doing so, it makes every second feel public. The first responders were not yet visible, but the sense of response had already begun. In the background, far from the tunnel's mouth, the machinery of emergency protocol was waking up. Calls were being routed. Locations were being verified. Channels were being assigned. A city preparing to enter a moment it would later claim to understand. Back at the wreckage, someone said a name. Maybe they recognized her, maybe they were guessing, but recognition in those first minutes is unstable. You see a face half lit by tunnel lamps and headlights, and your brain fills gaps with familiarity. If you believe you've recognized someone famous, the scene transforms again. It becomes less accident and more event. A few witnesses would later describe how quickly the atmosphere changed once the idea took hold. The tunnel felt smaller. People became more cautious, as if touching the wreckage might mean touching history. The instinct to help began to compete with the instinct to witness. And yet, in the middle of that, the human reality remained. A woman was alive, the night was still open, and decisions were about to matter. Then the first flashes of official light began to reflect against the tunnel walls. Blue, white, flickering in rhythm, approaching with a sound that grew from faint to unmistakable. The tunnel, which had held the crash in private concrete silence, began to fill with the language of response. Radios, footsteps, clipped commands, equipment being pulled from vehicle with trained urgency. This is the moment where events start turning into record, where what happened becomes what can be documented, where the first official words are spoken into a system that claims to remember everything. And somewhere in that transition between living witness and institutional timeline, the most important part of the night begins. Not the crash itself, but what the city chose to record about what happened next. When emergency responders entered the tunnel, the scene shifted from chaos to structure. Not because everything was suddenly under control, but because control is what protocol demands. Radios clicked on. Commands were exchanged in short, efficient phrases. Roles were assigned without discussion. In moments like this, procedure moves faster than emotion. The first task was assessment, not history, not cause, just condition, who is alive, who is conscious, who needs immediate intervention. Princess Diana was still breathing when the responders reached her. Multiple accounts confirmed this. She was not walking, not speaking clearly, but she was responsive. Her body reacted to voices. Her eyes opened. These are not dramatic details, but medical ones, and they matter because they determine classification. In emergency medicine, classification drives everything. A conscious patient is treated differently from an unconscious one. A responsive patient suggests time. Limited, fragile time, but time nonetheless. This assessment does not guarantee survival, but it shapes the next steps. Stabilize, monitor, prepare for transport. Responders worked inside the damaged vehicle carefully. The wreckage was unstable, metal compressed in ways that restricted access. Every movement had to balance urgency against the risk of making injuries worse. Equipment was brought in. Oxygen was administered. Vital signs were checked under conditions that were far from ideal. Witnesses watching from a distance later described the scene as controlled. There was no frantic rushing, no shouting. The responders moved deliberately, communicating with each other in low voices, as if trying not to escalate the situation beyond what it already was. This calm would later become controversial. To some, it suggested professionalism, to others, delay. But calm in emergency medicine does not mean inaction. It often means that responders believe the situation is manageable, that the patient can be stabilized where they are before transport becomes necessary. That belief, however, depends entirely on the initial assessment. Diana's injuries were serious, but at this stage they were not yet categorized as fatal. Doctors would later confirm that she did not die instantly, that she survived long enough for treatment decisions to matter. This is where the timeline begins to strain, because while responders were assessing and stabilizing, time was passing. Minutes accumulated quietly without urgency attached to them. The ambulance did not depart immediately. Instead, care continued at the scene, following protocol designed for patients believed to have a chance. Inside the emergency system, information was being transmitted. Status updates, requests for support, classifications that reduced a complex human situation into operational language. Somewhere in that flow of information, Diana was defined not as a symbol, not as a public figure, but as a patient. And how she was defined in those first minutes shaped everything that followed. Witnesses later gave conflicting accounts of what they saw. Some believed she was speaking. Others said she was silent. Some thought responders were moving quickly. Others remembered long pauses. These contradictions are not unusual. Human memory fractures under stress, especially when people observe from different angles and distances. But the medical record tells a clearer story. Diana's condition deteriorated after the initial assessment. What began as controlled became critical. The window that seemed to exist began to close. At some point, the classification changed. Urgency increased, language shifted. The patient was no longer stable enough to remain at the scene. Transport became necessary, not as a next step, but as an emergency. By the time the ambulance began moving toward the hospital, the situation no longer resembled the early moments inside the tunnel. What had been uncertain was now grave. What had been open was now narrowing fast. This progression, manageable to critical, is not unusual in trauma cases. What makes this night different is not that deterioration occurred, but how little clarity exists about when it was recognized and how that recognition was communicated. The earliest assessment suggested time. The later outcome suggests there was none. Somewhere between those 2 points, the story changed. And because the first communications were never fully released, the public cannot see that change happen. We are shown the end of the process without being allowed to understand the beginning. The first assessment mattered. The way it was communicated mattered. And the moment it stopped being true mattered most of all. This is the point where the night stopped being a series of reactions and became a sequence of irreversible decisions. And those decisions were guided by information that has never been fully heard. Every emergency has a beginning that feels smaller than it really is. Not the crash, not the injury, but the first description of what happened, the moment when chaos is translated into language. In that translation, meaning is shaped long before outcomes are known. In Paris, that shaping begins with a call. Before ambulances move, before hospitals prepare, before decisions are justified, later in reports, someone speaks into the system. A witness, a patrol unit, a dispatcher relaying information forward. The words used in that first exchange matter more than most people realize, because emergency systems do not respond to reality. They respond to descriptions of reality. Inside the Pont de l'Alma tunnel, as responders worked around the wreckage, information was already moving upward through the network. Questions were asked and answered in fragments, location confirmed, number of vehicles, number of injured, and then the question that quietly determines the speed of everything that follows. Is the passenger conscious? Conscious is a clinical word, but it carries weight. It does not mean unharmed. It does not mean safe, but it suggests presence, awareness, the ability of a body to compensate, at least for a moment longer. In emergency classification, conscious often places an incident in a category that allows for control rather than immediacy. According to later accounts, that word was used, not shouted, not emphasized, simply stated. And once stated, it framed the situation. Within emergency systems, frames are powerful. They shape how responders perceive risk. They influence whether time feels scarce or available. They affect how protocols are interpreted in practice rather than theory. If a patient is conscious, stabilization becomes a priority. If a patient is unconscious, speed becomes everything. This is not negligence, it is training. Dispatchers are taught to reduce complexity into manageable signals. Their goal is not to predict outcomes, but to assign resources efficiently. The system assumes that classifications will update as situations evolve. What it does not account for is how strongly the first classification lingers. In Diana's case, that first frame appears to have held. Radio traffic that followed, according to later recollections, did not carry the urgency associated with a patient in immediate cardiac distress. Instructions were given, updates were exchanged, but the tone remained measured, controlled, as if the night had not yet crossed into catastrophe. This does not mean responders were indifferent. It means they were operating within a structure that believed it understood the situation. And that belief came from the call. Later, when Diana's condition worsened, the frame had to change. Language shifted. The emergency became medical rather than logistical. The focus moved from stabilization to survival. But by then, minutes had passed under a different assumption. Those minutes matter. In trauma care, early decisions compound. The pace set at the beginning influences everything downstream. Once a situation is classified as manageable, reversing that classification takes time, communication, and proof. Systems resist abrupt change unless forced by undeniable signals, and those signals often arrive late. What makes this night different is not that a classification was made, but that the public has never been allowed to hear how it was made. The first call, the moment when conscious entered the system, has never been released. There is no audio to analyze, no transcript to examine, no way to hear tone, hesitation, or context. Without that record, the frame becomes invisible. The official narrative begins later, once urgency is already obvious. The public is shown the end of the process without being allowed to understand the beginning. The call that shaped the response exists only as an implication, inferred from decisions that followed. Some emergency professionals who later reviewed the case suggested that if the initial description had emphasized instability rather than consciousness, the response might have unfolded differently. Others caution against such speculation, noting that trauma outcomes are unpredictable even with perfect information. Both positions can be true. What remains undeniable is that the system responded to the information it received, and the earliest information appears to have suggested time. Time that may not have truly existed. This is the quiet power of the first call. It does not decide fate on its own, but it narrows the range of possible responses. It turns uncertainty into a working assumption. And once that assumption is in place, changing it becomes difficult. In the tunnel that night, a word entered the system, and the system believed it. By the time the belief was challenged, the night had already moved forward. And history, as it so often does, would begin its record only after that moment had passed. Time, inside an emergency, is not measured the way it is outside of one. It is not counted in minutes or seconds, but in classifications: stable, unstable, critical. Each label carries an implied tempo, and once that tempo is set, everything else adjusts to it. Emergency systems do not experience urgency emotionally. They experience it structurally. In Paris, as in most modern cities, emergency response is governed by layered protocols. These protocols are designed to remove hesitation by assigning meaning to conditions. A patient's status determines not just what is done, but how fast it must be done. Time, in this sense, becomes the decision rather than a constant. When Diana was first assessed as conscious, the system interpreted that information as a form of time. Not unlimited time, but usable time. Enough time to stabilize. Enough time to manage risk. Enough time to proceed according to procedure rather than instinct. This interpretation does not come from indifference, it comes from experience. In countless cases, conscious trauma patients survive because responders resist panic. They immobilize, they monitor, they act deliberately. The system is designed to reward restraint when restraint appears justified. But restraint depends entirely on accuracy. Inside emergency protocols, there is a critical assumption that information will update faster than conditions deteriorate, that as a patient worsens, the system will be informed quickly enough to adjust its response. That classifications are temporary and flexible. That assumption is usually correct, but it is not guaranteed. In the tunnel, responders worked under the belief that they understood the situation. The patient was injured but alive, serious but not yet catastrophic. That belief shaped how time was used. Actions were taken carefully. Decisions were sequenced rather than rushed. From the outside, this can look like delay. From the inside, it feels like control. The difficulty arises when the system's sense of time no longer matches reality. Trauma does not always deteriorate gradually. Internal injuries can progress silently. A patient can appear responsive while vital systems are already failing. In these cases, the margin between manageable and critical collapses without warning. When that collapse happens, systems must pivot. But pivoting takes communication. Someone must recognize the change, someone must describe it accurately, someone must update the classification. Until that happens, the system continues to behave as if time exists. Later, medical reports confirmed that Diana's internal injuries were severe, that once her condition deteriorated, the situation became irreversible despite intervention. What remains unclear is when that deterioration was recognized as such within the system. Did responders realize immediately? Did the classification lag behind reality? Or did the system receive conflicting signals? These questions matter because emergency systems do not fail loudly. They fail quietly by continuing to do what they were designed to do under assumptions that are no longer valid. In the absence of the first radio recording, it is impossible to reconstruct how time was being interpreted minute by minute. We do not know when the system still believed it had time and when it realized it did not. What we do know is that the ambulance remained at the scene longer than many observers expected. We know that the pace of response appeared controlled rather than frantic, and we know that by the time transport became urgent, the window for intervention had narrowed dramatically. This does not imply error, it implies vulnerability. Emergency systems are strong because they reduce complexity. But that same reduction can become a weakness when reality changes faster than the system can reclassify it. In Diana's case, the system appears to have acted consistently with the information it had. The problem is that the public cannot see that information change over time. We are shown the outcome without being shown the evolution. Without access to the early communications, time becomes compressed in retrospect. What may have unfolded over many uncertain minutes is remembered as a single, continuous failure or success, depending on perspective. This is how history flattens emergencies. The system's internal sense of time, its pauses, reassessments, and gradual shifts, disappears. What remains is a question that feels deceptively simple. Why didn't they move faster? But faster than what? Faster than which understanding of the situation? Faster according to which moment in time? These questions cannot be answered without hearing how time was described when it still mattered. Inside the tunnel, time was being managed. Outside the tunnel, time was being judged. And between those two perspectives, the truth became difficult to locate, because time, once decided by a system, rarely looks the same when viewed afterward. There is a moment in every emergency when the story changes shape. It is not always obvious, and it is rarely announced. It happens quietly, often between updates, when what responders are seeing no longer matches what the system believes is happening. For Princess Diana, that moment appears to have occurred somewhere between the tunnel and the hospital. By the time the ambulance began moving, the situation was no longer framed as control. Something had shifted. The calm, deliberate pace that characterized the early response gave way to urgency. Not sudden panic, but a tightening of decisions, a narrowing of options. This is the point where timelines become unstable. Official records describe a clear sequence: assessment, stabilization, transport, hospital intervention. On paper, it reads as orderly, but paper timelines rarely capture the moment when confidence erodes. They do not record hesitation, doubt, or the subtle realization that earlier assumptions may no longer hold. Inside the ambulance, conditions changed. Medical staff later confirmed that Diana's condition deteriorated rapidly during transport. What had once seemed manageable became critical. Vital signs worsened. The margin that appeared to exist inside the tunnel collapsed under the reality of internal injuries that could not be fully addressed on the roadside. This is when emergency systems pivot, language shifts, priorities reorder, time becomes scarce. But pivots take time themselves. They require recognition and communication. The system must be told that its previous understanding is no longer valid. Until that happens, procedures continue as if the earlier frame still applies. This creates a dangerous overlap, an interval where reality has changed, but the system has not fully caught up. It is within this overlap that the timeline becomes most difficult to reconstruct. Some later accounts suggest that the deterioration was sudden and unavoidable. Others imply that warning signs may have appeared earlier, but were masked by the patient's initial responsiveness. Both interpretations coexist because the record does not clearly show when the shift was acknowledged. The ambulance route itself became part of the controversy. Why did it take so long? Why was speed seemingly secondary? Why were decisions made that, in hindsight, appear costly? These questions assume that the situation was understood in the same way at every moment. But emergencies do not unfold with hindsight. They unfold with partial information, interpreted under pressure, inside systems that must commit to a course of action before certainty exists. Once the ambulance was en route, the night entered a new phase. The focus moved away from the crash and toward survival. Hospitals were alerted, specialists prepared, the emergency became centralized, concentrated within a moving vehicle racing against a body that was losing its ability to compensate. When Diana arrived at the hospital, the narrative hardened again. What followed was medical intervention, then loss, then official confirmation. From that point forward, the timeline becomes fixed. Death marks an endpoint that organizes everything before it. But what came before that endpoint remains fluid. The shift from controlled emergency to critical failure exists in a gray zone that official summaries struggle to capture. It is neither beginning nor end. It is transition. And transitions are where systems are most vulnerable because systems are built for categories, not gradients. They know how to respond to stable and critical. They are less comfortable with becoming critical. In Diana's case, the timeline appears to pivot without fully revealing how or why. The early calm is remembered as delay. The later urgency is remembered as too late. Between the two lies a stretch of time that cannot be easily labeled. That stretch is where interpretation begins. Some see it as evidence of failure, others see it as an unavoidable consequence of trauma medicine. Still others see it as something the public was never meant to examine too closely. What is certain is that once a timeline shifted, there was no return. Decisions made under earlier assumptions could not be undone. The night moved forward, carrying with it the weight of every classification that had come before. From this point on, the story would no longer be about what might have happened. It would be about what could no longer be changed. And that is where records become selective. Because once outcomes are fixed, attention turns away from process and toward closure. The questions narrow, the system prepares its explanations, and anything that complicates the final version begins to fade from view. The timeline had shifted, and with it, the space for uncertainty began to disappear. After the outcome was confirmed, the focus shifted from response to explanation. This is how emergencies end, not when life is lost, but when systems begin to speak about what happened. Reports are written, timelines are finalized, language hardens into conclusions. And yet, in the case of Princess Diana, something remained unresolved: a silence. In emergency response, silence is not the absence of sound. It is the absence of record, the place where information should exist but does not. The gap where procedure promises memory, but memory cannot be produced. From the outside, the investigation appeared exhaustive. Witnesses were interviewed. Medical professionals testified. Security footage was examined. Diagrams were drawn. Every visible element of the night was cataloged and reviewed. But the earliest communications, the ones that framed the response before urgency took over, were never made public. There was no audio of the first radio exchanges, no transcript of the initial classification, no way to hear how Diana was described when the system first learned of the crash. Official explanations were consistent in one respect. There was no recording to release. The statement was delivered without elaboration. No technical failure was cited. No system malfunction was acknowledged. The absence itself was treated as unremarkable. But for those familiar with the emergency systems, it was anything but. These systems are designed to preserve information precisely because early moments are chaotic. They exist to prevent memory from becoming the only source of truth. When records are missing, it undermines the very logic the system is built upon. Silence in this context is not neutral. It reshapes interpretation. Without the early communications, later decisions appear isolated from their context. Actions that may have been reasonable at the time can look questionable in hindsight. The system is judged not by what it knew, but by what it appears to have done. This is where speculation begins. Why wasn't the ambulance faster? Why did urgency seem delayed? Why do witness accounts feel disconnected from official summaries? These questions grow louder in the absence of primary records. And as they grow louder, institutions often respond not with additional information, but with repetition. There is no recording. There is nothing to release. The case has been examined. Repetition has a purpose. It stabilizes narratives. It discourages further inquiry by presenting finality as fact. Over time, the absence of evidence becomes accepted as evidence of absence. But silence does not resolve uncertainty. It preserves it. For decades, the missing early records have allowed multiple interpretations to coexist. Some view the response as competent but overwhelmed. Others see hesitation where there should have been urgency. Still others believe the truth lies somewhere between human limitation and systemic rigidity. What unites these interpretations is not belief, but lack. Lack of sound, lack of tone, lack of the moment when the system first decided how serious the night was. In many cases, recordings are released not to prove wrongdoing, but to provide closure. They allow the public to hear what responders heard, to understand how decisions were shaped in real time. They reduce speculation by replacing imagination with documentation. Here, that option never existed. The silence remained. And silence, once accepted, has a strange effect on history. It encourages certainty where none exists. It allows conclusions to settle without challenge. It turns unanswered questions into background noise. The story moves on, but something essential is left behind. Not a secret, not a confession, just a missing piece of process. In the end, the absence of early records did not change the outcome, but it changed how the outcome would be remembered. Without those records, the public could never fully trace how the night evolved from accident to emergency to tragedy. The system spoke loudly after the fact. This was not the only recording the system couldn't explain.